Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining. And I mean, I know some of you, and some of you know me. We have this company called Diversity by Design. And I suppose the best way of describing that was that we came into this in 2010 and we sensed that there was something that we could do where we thought we could work with people to create interventions that created change, because there was an awful lot going on in diversity, but actually not an awful lot of change. So the dial wasn't really moving. So we really did that to develop a sense of purpose with people and also to set a sense of effectiveness. So that's what we've been doing over this period, and we work with all sorts of people across all sorts of sectors. But it's really about change and effectiveness and the underlying assumption is that you need to change processes and ways of thinking, not what you think, but ways of thinking in order to achieve that organisational change.
Brilliant, Simon, thank you. And Lynn, would you like to introduce yourself and Lead in Kind?
Yes, thanks, Sheila. Hi, everybody. I'm Lynn from Lead in Kind, and we are a small culture consultancy, and we have a particular focus on making work fairer and workplaces kinder and more inclusive so that outcomes improve for people and for the bottom line. And much like Simon described, we've got a real focus on making change happen. So we are got a particular focus on the systems and the processes, and actually how do you change those? How do enhanced pay systems actually remove barriers for people and things like recruitment and progression. We want to get in and around actually the changes that need to be made to help, as I said, improve outcomes for people and the bottom line. And when it's my turn, I'll be talking a little bit more about the background and some of the frustrations that we felt because that change hasn't happened as much as we would expect it to.
Thank you, Lynn. So I better give you a little background. So my name is Sheila Walsh. I know some of you, I don't know others. My company is called LS Advantage, and LS stands for Effective Leadership Inclusive Solutions. And that was born out of this idea that inclusive leadership might need to think a little bit more about how it's going to actually help organizations and not just about the inclusion part of inclusive leadership. So from there, we might take it away and move us over to Lynn.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about all things information. And I think what would be really helpful to share with you today is a little bit both about the context of how we've ended up having these conversations, but also to share with you the insights that we've got as a result of the conversations that we've had with people over the last year. And to do that, I think it's probably quite important for me to give you a little bit of context about myself and my own experience of working in the field of equality and human rights. So I actually started working in the field of equality and human rights in 1999, so some 25 years ago. At that point, I would reflect that it was really hard to be having conversations with people in the C-suite about the need to take an inclusive approach, why this was important, why it should be on the radar. That time, I would reflect that the time we got to about 2006, people were starting to have a much more increased awareness of the business case for diversity, the ethical case, it's the right thing to do. And of course, the legislative frameworks had changed. We started to have regulations, particularly across Great Britain, about different protected characteristics. So there was much more of various different directions to start doing work on equality. And at that point, people were talking about, well, we need to get more information. These are the inequalities that need to be addressed. And leaders were starting to come on board and say that, this was an important area to look at. By 2010, we had the Equality Act. We thought things were going to be a bit simpler. But 2010 was also a time where I took a step back from, if you like, active practice within equality and diversity work. So I went to undertake research. My particular area of focus is information use, and specifically how information is used in public policy for public good. And it probably won't surprise you, I'll give you the very short version is generally information isn't used particularly well when it comes to making decisions about public good. So, I had my little break. It was nearly 9 years. So in 2019, I came back actively to practice in the field of equality. And what I would reflect from that time is the conversations I didn't feel had moved on particularly well from the conversations that had happened in 2006. People were still saying, well, we need more information, or people were sharing information with better lens on intersectionality. We had a much better idea of actually the experiences and the inequalities that people were experiencing. I would still recognise that lots of faces, people that I really respected and admired, who were shouting even more loudly about the issues that need to be addressed. And we had leaders, again, who were very publicly saying, you know, work on this is important. But the reality was the dial wasn't shifting. Things hadn't changed. We just had more awareness. And, you know, people were having conversations that I felt were perhaps in the wrong place. So people, I guess, in positions of power in the equality landscape, arguing about, is it equality, is it equity, what were we talking about, I guess, rather than doing some of the work. And I was increasingly being frustrated by hearing people talking about, I'm not able to do this work, and then leaders saying, you know, this work isn't happening. So I wanted to understand more about why this was, and hence that's the conversations with Sheila and Simon that started. But as a collective, we wanted to understand, you know, was our own particular perspective quite narrow, or was it shared? So we started these conversations, our diversity disruptor conversations last year. And what we heard from people was this issue of information was really key. And there was two different sides to this. So one was about the information that was informing approaches to equality in the workplace. And the other was information about the capacity and capability to ensure that you had the right support in place, whether that was EDI teams or external support. So I want to ask you, if you have all the information that you need, you've got the right information to help guide your work. And that could be in terms of information just to have confident conversations. It might be information you need to influence change, if you're an EDI practitioner, for example, or if you are in a governance position or a leadership position, have you got the information that you need to be able to discharge your scrutiny obligations, or set the right direction? I'm going to have to put my specs on here just to see what the poll results are. So yeah, the minute it looks like most people are either saying that they don't have the right information, or they're not sure that they have the right information. And that very much chimes with what we heard in the conversations that we had with people, if you like, we were out on the road asking these things. So people were talking about, still there was gaps, if you like, with workforce data, or people would have data, but they were using it to report on, not using it to actually inform practice. But equally, I think one of the big areas where people were saying that they had issues in relation to information was information to help guide the procurement of expertise and support. For me, one of the areas that we work in a lot is supporting organisations with what I call inclusive design. But anybody who works in the public sector facing role will probably know as a quality impact assessment. And I've got on the next slide just a good example of where we might have made advances on representative diversity, but it hasn't actually led to, I guess, improved information to help decision making. So this is an example from the pandemic. But what we were finding increasingly is that people were saying that the information that they have was not informing decisions well. They didn't either had a paucity of information, so in the example of the pandemic planning here, or they weren't having the cultures that were able to, I guess, surface the diverse viewpoints that they would have. And even today, I'm reflecting on the most recent tribunal case that has just been published with regard to Rape Crisis Scotland. So I don't know if anybody's had a chance to look at that. But part of the findings is kind of flagging up just actually where was advice coming from that actually helped shape the direction of travel within that organisation in respect of the investigation that they had. So how was that information used? We are still in this situation some 25 years later, or 14 years after the Equality Act, where we're still not using information to actually change systems and practices. We still are just talking, I think, about inclusion rather than doing it. So my next slide kind of relates to where information is sitting within an organisation. How the location of information can actually change practice. So lots of people were saying to us that they felt that in their experience, their EDI teams perhaps weren't located either at the right level or in the right area within an organisation. So perhaps there wasn't routes to influence, perhaps there wasn't connections to oversight and scrutiny frameworks within an organisation, or perhaps, if it was located within human resources, for example, there might be a kind of disconnect from influencing practice actually within human resources or across the broader organisation. So I'm really interested to see that actually I think the majority of people here are saying that the EDI team in their workplace isn't driving change to support organisational objectives, what the EDI teams are doing. And again, that really resonated with the findings that we had from the people in our conversations. I think a real sense that, there's a positive thing to have people who are passionate and advocate for issues of inclusion, but very often people would be taking an activist role when it came to issues of EDI rather than connecting it to, the purpose of the organisation. So that led us to have, ask, are the conversations being held at the right levels? And is it the right conversations as well? We were increasingly, as Sheila alluded to, getting the sense that people were hesitant, reluctant to have some of the really important conversations about issues of inclusion, whether that was about anti-racist stances or the issues between sex and gender conversations in the workplace, how you create places where people are able to share their thoughts in a constructive way. There was a real sense that that wasn't happening. So again, I'd be really interested to hear if that resonates with you. And I know that Simon's going to have a lot more to say about the conversations in the workplace.
Just these four thoughts, really. The first is that my sense, and I alluded to a little bit at the beginning, was that this has got to be about change. So when people started, when I say people, I mean senior people, started on this, I think there was a sense of, yes, absolutely, we've got to do diversity and inclusion. It's jolly important, absolutely marvellous, let's do it. And it came from a very good place. There was a sense that, well, we don't want discrimination in our country, in our company. We don't want discrimination. We want to have access to talent, and we don't want that talent to be blocked. And when we get here, we want people to have a good time at work, be able to contribute so they can perform at their best. And I think that was in the back of people's minds, but they didn't make it particularly explicit. And worst of all, in a sense, what they did was they said, right, we wanted to get on with it. And so they delegated it largely. And it, as we all know, it got delegated to HR and whatever. But actually, I think what happened in that was that the delegation meant that relatively junior people, particularly people coming in from an expertise that was not actually professional, it was more personal. So people were arriving there and for whatever reason, because they were in some way connected with one of the protected characteristics. That was how they were acquiring their expertise. Now, I put my hands up. I don't have a qualification in diversity. I have 40 years of campaigning for equality and stuff and what I've learned. So I do accept that there's a real value to what people have learned. But what happened, unfortunately, I think, was that it was delegated in such a way that the product of that delegation was a set of processes or policies, and actually not, in the second point, not linked absolutely clearly to the strategic goals of the company. The one I always use to illustrate this is an English literature department in a big university, Russell Group University, some years back asked us to help them add diversity to the staff. And I said to the head of the department, okay, fine, but why? Because what you're doing is, you're doing really well. Your research is great, your application is great, your tariff is really high, your degree attainment is great, blah, blah. What problem you're trying to solve. And the head of department said to me, it's easily stated, and it is this. There is a lot of literature being written in English by people who are not English. I want to represent that part of the modern canon in the teaching and research we do in this department. What it would look like is ethnic diversity. That's not what she wanted. She wanted cultural and geographic diversity. And what I learned from that was that very specific, the strength of that very specific link between the strategic output. In her case, the strategic outcomes there are enriching the research and the teaching, which would have all sorts of engagement with the students and with different subjects, and different publications and so on and so forth. So in all ways, that expanding to represent the modern English literature canon would enrich the core purpose of what she was doing in that department. And I've taken that away a lot. I'm just working with a water company at the moment. Why? You know, they're doing diversity. They're really good. They really want to know why they're doing it. Water companies are regional. They are geographic. They are monopolies. They have a responsibility to customers who can't opt out, can't get your water from somewhere else. So that determines a lot about how they are as a company in the region that they're in. So their diversity strategy is all around customers, community, and skills. Doesn't begin with a C, so I call it competencies. But in other words, that is about saying, for instance, we're a regional company, we're an anchor employer. Are we offering opportunities for all the population who want to come and work for us? Or are there pockets of the population who simply aren't coming and working for us? Very good question. What do we need to do in order to make that happen? So instead of starting from the kind of protected characteristics, identity questions, they started from purpose and then thought about notions of talent and opportunity, which are absolutely linked to the fact that they're a regional and geographically based organisation. They then got a set of other questions which are about the historic nature of the pipeline into the business. For instance, I mean, typically, water company has a very male and actually largely kind of older workforce at the moment. So there are all sorts of strategic questions, and it's that absolute link that moves diversity and inclusion back into the center as a talent strategy for what the organization is trying to achieve. And it stops it being that delegated function which ends up with a set of processes and policies that simply get churned out or put on the shelf or wherever they end up. The other thing that happened was that people thought, right, we'll do diversity, delegate it down. The delegated functions then think, well, what we'll do, we get the supermarket trolley, a shopping trolley, and we'll potter along the aisle of the diversity supermarket, and we will fill our trolley with all the standard ingredients. So we'll do lanyards, of course, who wishes like me that they'd been early investors in lanyards, we'd all be millionaires. Lanyards, religious calendar, samosas, vegetarian diet, all these, all fine. Float at Pride, support BLM, all this stuff's fantastic, all fine, all starts conversations, great. Practically none of it changes anything, and some of it is highly contested. But it's absolute evidence of the way in which diversity is seen as a series of little initiatives, mainly around minorities, or in the case of women, minority status groups. It's not, again, seen as this strategic link. And as part of that, they started staff groups or employee resource networks, or they've got 103 different names. But what happened with those groups was that they were based on a notion of identity. They weren't based on the idea of engagement or inclusion, where people were asked to bring the different voices that they could bring into the achievement of the organization. So they became things, and they would talk about holding the organization to account. Whereas what I would argue and do a lot of work with staff groups and say, it's not about you holding the organization to account, it's about the organization giving you the support so you can be accountable to the objectives that the organization's got and enhance and add to those. So we created a bit of a monster in these staff groups, and part of the problem now is that they've done two things. They end up being dominated by the people who are passionate, but the downside of that is they can often represent only one voice in their constituency rather than the whole of their constituency. And the company doesn't say to them, what are you going to do to find out everybody's voice of all the women or all the gay people or whatever it is? And then the company, by accident or by default, starts to think of that as the sole voice of that group of employees. So that becomes then a self-fulfilling thing. And what then happens is that those groups of people then make demands on the company that actually they want to make on the world. So you end up with them saying, high street supermarket, government regulator, all these are good examples, actual real examples. What's your position on Palestine and Israel? Well, in the supermarket's case, what's that got to do with the price of beans? How does that actually help the organization? These are, by their nature, divisive subjects. So they're going to divide your staff. So staff activism has that terrible danger that instead of unifying people in the common cause of the company, actually what happens is it divides. But it's covered with this notion that passion is good, that activism is good, and of course it is. But is it appropriate? How do we make that valuable to the company rather than to the outside world. And the last point really is sort of picking up what Lynn was saying, but what do people measure? If they think that having an approach to diversity, having an approach to inclusion, the trouble is that people measure inputs the whole time. It's much more difficult to measure outcomes. But if you really want to measure the outcome of greater diversity and inclusion, you need to start measuring belonging, but you also need to start measuring people's connectedness to the core objectives of the company. You need to start measuring the extent to which people feel they can contribute their voice at work and don't feel in some ways that they're inhibited from expressing their views at work. Because ultimately, inclusion is really about including all voices. It's not, you've got to speak like this, think like this, and behave like this, and if you don't, we'll exclude you. It's the absolute opposite of that. It is the way in which we engage all voices within the achievement of that common objective. So all of this is built around actually quite an old-fashioned idea of what a bureaucracy and what work is, and it's that we're all strangers when we get to work. We don't know each other. What we've got in common is what the organisation's decided to do. And fundamentally what we need to do is find ways of collaborating through each other's differences in pursuit of that common aim. And so we don't look for total agreement. We look for a sense of tolerance and how we can build an organisation that's effective. So I'd be really interested to think, am I right? Was it delegated to the disservice? How do we re-establish that strategic link? How do we get staff groups accountable to the purpose of the organisation rather than other external political agendas? And lastly, what do we need to measure in order to show that we're being effective in the work that we're trying to do?
Thank you, Simon. So I think it's really helpful from my perspective. When I met Lynn and Simon and we were talking, there was this agreement, ironically, that the aim isn't that we all agree, but that we're able to be effective in the workplace and work on these areas. And I suppose it leads to a very important part of the work that I do, which is thinking about the boundaries of inclusive leadership, because sometimes it becomes a catch-all phrase for whatever I want it to mean. And even in some of my research too, with my PhD, it's become really clear that it is how we define inclusive leadership and what we think it is has very little to do with what it means or any shared meaning, and more to do with what we want it to mean. And the question is, what's the purpose of inclusive leadership from your point of view? But one of the things that can often get lost is the purpose of it versus my preference for it. And I think it's really important we think about the purpose of everything we do in a workplace. So one of the biggest challenges that I'm finding in practice and in the research is that there's actually that misconception that it's about keeping everyone happy, or that a good inclusive approach means everyone is happy. But actually that leads us to people pleasing and not to leadership or effectiveness or even inclusion. Because sometimes for people to be happy is the desire for their position, their point of view, their worldview to be dominant of everyone else's. And so the idea of keeping people happy is not the same as being inclusive. So if we think about it for a second, when I break it down, I have kind of two boundaries around it myself when I think about it. And the research aligns with this as well. So effectively leading within a contextual reality. So if I'm an inclusive leader in an organization, there will be organizational boundaries to my leadership and my inclusion. But if I'm a political leader, there might be a different boundary to that because there might be a different set of expectations. And the prime example that I usually give is this one. There is always an organizational context to inclusive leadership, because you can be inclusive, but it still has to be inclusive in an effort to meet the purpose of the organization, which both Lynn and Simon have pointed to. And my example is, unfortunately, I can't go to the Irish Law Society and say, let me be your chairperson. I don't have any legal background, for instance. So I'm excluded, but that's appropriate because it's supporting the purpose of the organization. Now, if there was reasons I'm excluded that does not directly relate to supporting the purpose, then we could navigate what an inclusive organization might look like. The other part of inclusion is that when I talk to people about inclusive leadership, they often think about inclusion and not leadership. They think about all the things you should do to be inclusive. But actually, inclusion is a practice that we use within leadership. So you're leading, you're influencing, and you could be any one of the three leaders. You could be leading with a formal position, you could be leading because you're a thought leader or you influence through a level of expertise, or you might be leading because you're a social leader and you influence through your relationships and your connections. But inclusion is something you use within that influencing mechanism. Otherwise, what ends up happening is we go down some rabbit holes and we get lost in some other agendas. And one of the examples I make about society and organizations is this. In society, the fact that you exist means, in my opinion, you have a right to be included and to be supported and to be safe. But in an organization, you have a right to be included because you contribute to the purpose of the organization. And so we need to think about inclusive leadership a bit more broadly. And that's come up in the last 4.5 years of research, but it's also coming up quite a bit in organizations when people are facing challenges. So I'm going to say kind of 4 or 5 things that it's not, based on the research, based on my research, and also based on the conversations we're having in workplaces today. It isn't about keeping everyone happy. It isn't about getting it right before you start. It isn't about doing it 2 or 4 people. It is not the opposite to discrimination, and it is not natural. Sometimes in inclusive leadership, you're not going to keep everyone happy. You're actually going to have to work with multiple complexities. There might be multiple different needs occurring, and you're going to have to make decisions about what's the best for this reality in terms of what you're trying to achieve and the task you're trying to move towards. The reality is that one of the biggest barriers that we're seeing, and again, this came from the data from across Ireland and the UK so far, is that, and there's my dyslexia, starting instead of starting, so forgive me in advance. There's a piece here where what we actually have to think about is there's so much focus on getting it right and a fear of getting it wrong and a fear of being called out and a fear of being judged that we're actually sometimes not starting at all, which I think leads to some of Lynn's points and also Simon's points. So there has to be this middle ground of starting where we are and being willing to learn as we go, rather than only starting when we think there's absolutely no rebuttal to our points of view. Because what we're trying to do accidentally by only starting when it's perfect, my dyslexia is all over these slides, so my apologies, it's been a long week. What we're doing when we don't start with where we are, we're trying to get everything perfect, it's actually trying to stop having conversations with people. We're trying to get it perfect so we can move on, but we're actually not including people in informing what good looks like. And so we're already not including people because we're trying to be ahead of everybody. This is where it leads to, we can't do it for or to people, it has to be done with them. One of the biggest issues we're having around inclusion is that people are making decisions about what's inclusive. To Simon's point, deciding that a whole community or a whole group of people who are marginalized believe the same thing because that's the dominant voice that's coming from the employee resource group or from a particular task force. But actually inclusion is relational. Think about it. Inclusion occurs between people. I can't include you unless you opt in and then inform that inclusion. And we're kind of skipping that relational piece. So we can't do it to people. We have to do it with them. It's a co-created experience. The other thing is that when we take that discrimination model, which is what most people are working at when they say, oh, we have an inclusive organization, and what they indirectly tell me is that they don't discriminate or that they have processes to avoid discrimination. But the reality is discrimination in any country is only based on what you can be legally held accountable for. You might not discriminate against me, but you might not be including me either. And so inclusion is actually on the other side. Discrimination, I say, is in the red zone. It's in the do not do those things, get those things sorted. That's out of control. Inclusion goes beyond what's legislated to think about how people thrive and how you can get the most from them and how they can contribute to the workplace. And so it's actually on the strengths-based. It's not a deficit model. Discrimination is based on a deficit model and mindset. Inclusion needs to work with a strengths-based approach. And then the other part is that it's actually a practice based on psychological principles. So inclusion, currently Shaw et al.'s 2011 definition, which I think is the most powerful for workplaces, is the balance of facilitating an experience of belonging. We can't make someone feel that they belong, but we can work within our remit to create experiences where they may experience belonging or they can influence it, but also that we value their uniqueness. And back to Simon's point, if we keep thinking about inclusion only through identity and not through uniqueness in a much broader sense, how do people, human beings, feel included in the workplace? We're going to keep coming back to an identity-based idea, which then moves us away from the actual experience someone is having in the room. And what I'm hearing a lot about is that a lot of the work being done in organizations, the very people it's meant to be representing are not feeling heard or seen or understood. And so there is actually an experience when you or I feel included. There's this balance in that experience of feeling like I belong here, but also feeling like I don't have to assimilate to belong, meaning I don't have to adapt to your rules. Actually, I can be myself, and because of what I contribute in the workplace, I belong. And that's a very particular mechanism that people like to think, oh, I'm inclusive or I'm not inclusive, or inclusion is natural. It's actually not natural because of groupthink, because of in and out group norms, because of group dynamics. And so inclusion is actually a practice we engage with or we don't. It's not actually something that we either have or we don't have. And so these are kind of 5 of the most common misconceptions and then insights that have come from the 4.5 years of research. And I'm not suggesting these are correct. I'm suggesting these are insights that are currently emerging. So let me stop sharing for a second. Somebody has a question there for Lynn, which is, what data do we need?
Well, clearly there's, you need to have information about either who your workforce is or your customer base. But I don't think we can just not do things because there might be an absence or a gap in the information that we have. And I guess it's, what is the purpose of the information? Is it because you're needing to convince somebody to get on board and see what the issues are? If you don't have your own internal evidence, there'll be similar information that you can get from elsewhere. Is it information about actually what changes might help? Then you're looking at research or practice from elsewhere. I was reflecting on a conversation that I'd had with an HR director a year or so ago who was looking to a senior EDI professional. And we had been talking about potential changes to the way in which recruitment has been done. And the thought was, well, we're really good at this because what we do is we blank out names on CVs, as if that was going to be the silver bullet to create an inclusive recruitment process. So in that sense, it wasn't necessarily about, the information about who's applying and not getting through that you would maybe need to look at. It was going to be like, well, actually, is that the kind of practice that is going to change the way that things function within an organisation? So I think it's like, what is the purpose of the information, what you're wanting to do with it? If it's about influence, if it's about change, I think people get too limited by saying, I don't have the information that I own or that I've commissioned. And what I found through my own research and looking at like political decision making is people like to have their own research that validates their own point. So there's a cycle of continually asking the questions over and over again.
I think it's also worth thinking, in addition to that, about two other things. One is the categories around which people collect information at university. And one of the problems with it is that if you're going to use a category that's useful for analysis, you need to know what the category is describing. So if you go around collecting BAME, information about people who are BAME, you actually get information about discrimination on the basis of colour. But if you look in, if you look at the census and you look at school results, the census, for instance, and you disaggregate them as the census does by ethnic categories, the 7 in the census, you can see that there are very different levels of school attainment, for instance, that kids who have different heritages. So we know that those are not coherent groups. We know that women is not a coherent group, and LGBTQIA+, etc., is completely an incoherent group. So my first thing would be really clear about the categories that you're using in order to collect information. And the second thing is collect it at different levels of the organization. I mean, I always think averages really are the enemy of change. So you need to know, and I think one of the key ones actually is whether people are being promoted to the level they want to be promoted to. Because not everybody wants to be the CEO, but people might well want to be promoted or develop. So, just adding to your point is, you need to know what you're using as an analytical framework and therefore what you're trying to understand. And in diversity, do that at all. They use very big, baggy categories, very clown pocket categories.
For sure. And I think that's one of we rely on, if you like, the cold, hard data. We're looking at the metrics about the workforce without actually thinking about the warm data. What is the employee voice? What do people actually experience? And I mean, much of our work is about trying to surface what that employee voice says, what people say it's really like. And I think that adds so much more weight, particularly when there's data gaps. So you're right, it's about, are people being able to give off their best, I think.
And Lynn, can I add to that? Because I think I really agree with both of what you're saying. I think sometimes we collect data and we think it means something, but it's not specific enough to mean it. One of the things I think is important is sometimes we're collecting data about something because it's mandated in some way, so maybe identity or something, but actually we might not be collecting data about need. And I have found, like, especially around disabilities, people with disabilities, or even just people who are saying what they actually need in the workplace, that sometimes instead of asking for religious identity, it can be really helpful to ask what dates are important to you that we could consider in our scheduling in some way. And I think that sometimes we get so focused on the identity, we're making all these assumptions about anyone with that identity, instead of actually going, well, are we serving the needs of our people?
That's right. That question of identity, I saw one the other day. People ask things like, they collect information. They collected on gender identity, but they merged that with sex. Well, these are two different sets of questions. You're trying to discover different things. The other one, I saw one the other day, which is, do you identify as disabled? Well, if you're an employer, you have an obligation if people are disabled. And there's actually, you can tell whether people are disabled or not because there's a definition, and that tells you your obligations. So you've got to be really careful, I think, about, as you're saying, not using kind of notions of the subjective necessarily too. I noticed Alex asked that question about should we be bringing our whole selves to work? And I always say whenever people ask me, I say, God forbid. I mean, it's work, it's not the pub. And the thing about it is that there's a formality to work which actually really helps people to collaborate. And one of the problems with the notion of bringing your whole self to work is that means you bring your political opinions in, bring your personal opinions in. I'm a gay man. I can work with people who don't approve of me. I really don't need other people's approval, as long as we can work together and bring our skills together, unless they actively treat me in a bad way. So I'm very nervous about it. And I always say to people when that question comes up, it's about putting the emphasis on the right word in the sentence. Bring a whole self, whereas I say it's bring a whole self to work. It's what you can bring through your story that enables you to collaborate with other people in pursuit of the common objective.
I want to make a point on that because something you said, Simon, once in one of our conversations was we tell people bring your whole self to work and be authentic, but we're not talking about the homophobic, racist, ableist person. And so we don't really mean that statement.
Or even, the bloke who's at work and his wife's at home and she looks after the kid. They're not told to bring their whole selves to work. They're told to shut up and look at their privilege.
But there's one other point, I think, around that one, which is I think it's good to always remember why people are saying it. The reason that statement has become normalized is because people had to mask to be safe at work. Absolutely. And instead of saying to people who were unsafe because of the societal, isms, actually what we want is for you to be able to not have to mask, hide that, or regulate it in the workplace because you're safe here. We started using the term bring your whole self to work, which is almost a completely different conversation to removing the risks that come with the isms for people who are marginalized and discriminated against. But we've done it again. We've generalized it to the point where it actually doesn't make sense, but it actually comes from the intention of we don't want you to hide the parts of yourself that waste your energy and that are not good for you as a person. So I have a question because Dawn asked this, and I think it's a good question for Lynn and for you, Simon. So how do we create belonging, which is enabled through ERGs, whilst balancing healthy activism? I think that's a really interesting question. So I'm going to pose it to both of you, really, to see what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, and it is difficult because activism is, and people's passionate engagement with the world is extremely important. But again, I think it's a little bit, Sheila's very helpful definition there or narrative on the origins of bringing a whole self to work. I think that applies to activism, doesn't it? Is that, what we've done now is we've enabled the idea that it's legitimate to bring into the world, into the workplace, what you feel about the world. And I think the question is, so how do you balance that? Well, I think the answer is probably this, is that there's something useful for leaders to make parameters. A couple of examples. I heard recently, and I can't find out who it is because the person who told me, who I trust enormously, who's a FTSE director and all that business, I suppose that's not necessarily a token of trust, but anyway, she is very trustworthy. She told me about a government agency, and there was a demand from certain sections of the staff that they took a position on Israel and Palestine. And the Director General wrote this email that said to everybody, look, AN1, everybody feels incredibly strongly about it, or most people do. However, number one, actually, we're a government arm's length body, we can't take a position. But set that aside, is that actually relevant to the way in which we're doing our work? Will it help us to do whatever it is that we do? And so therefore, yes, people will speak about this in informal context and they will talk about it where and when they want. But actually, as an organisation, so on the formal, the intranet, group emails, and so on and so forth, actually, that's not an appropriate place to have discussions that outwith the core purpose of what we're doing. And it was apparently greeted with an enormous sense of relief because people felt that they were at work and they could concentrate on work. No one was saying don't talk about it. They were talking about where to talk about it and then, of course, how to talk about it. So being careful with each other. So I think my answer would be twofold. One is that I think there are parameters about the formality of work, and I think that helps you in all sorts of contexts. That big statements actually don't help people to contribute, especially when they're very divisive. So what's useful in helping people to contribute? So making a parameter around the formal bits of work. And then I think with the ERGs, actually saying to them, we will support you, we'll give you time in rather than time off to be conveners of these groups. The quid pro quo of that is that we have a contract with you, you agree some objectives for the year, what you're going to do, we will support you in that, we'll make that part of your career development, your promotion perhaps, we will give you executive support, make sure your manager accepts that you're doing that and that's recognised as part of your work. The quid pro quo is you'll be accountable to the achievement of the objectives of the organisation. So you're balancing people's passion and energy with a sense of common purpose.
And I think I would just add to that as well. I think if you're going to have staff networks or ERG groups and there's this leadership commitment to do it, there has to be that connection to the leadership. There has to be that conduit so that people at the exec table can hear what's going on and are actively engaged as well. Because what I find a lot in my work is that there will be staff networks, but there's a disconnect. They might feed into whatever that might be called the EDI committee or what have you, but they end up becoming often adrift within the organisation. So I think it has to be an ongoing thing. They need to be needed and wanted by the staff because ultimately they are the ones that will be given their time to convene them and participate and shape and direct it. I don't think you can necessarily set them up for the sake of having them without any purpose. I find in organisations it's either gone feral and they've gone off somewhere, or they're withering on the vine because there hasn't been that connection to the organisation, there hasn't been the support, or there just isn't the interest. That it seemed like the good thing to do, the thing that Simon, you mentioned about the shopping cart. It's like, we must have these, we'll set them up. But of course, actually, they weren't really needed because people were probably felt quite included and were just able to get on with the day job and thought, well, if I'm going to be part of a network, it's going to be a network outside of work rather than inside of work.
Well, it's interesting, in the water company, the conveners of the group, after we'd had these two big discussions about what we were trying to do with the diversity strategy, the two conveners of the BAME group, as it was called, both wrote to me and went, we can't see the point of this now, because actually what we got in common, we're just all being lumped together in this thing. But as we started to reinvent something of a purpose about opportunities offered to the whole population across the region in which this company sits, actually they've kind of reinvigorated their purpose now, because now they're beginning to think interestingly about the different opportunities available to different people. And you know what I mean? So I think you're absolutely right. I think that link to purpose. It is interesting. Purpose and boundaries seem to come out of our discussions again and again when we have these discussions.
And can I just add about the ERG? So one of the things that I have found is there's two things. One is people join them and become really disillusioned or burnt out, or both. And that's on the good end, like over a period of time. The second issue I have is the majority of people who join them are actually those carrying the additional burden of the marginalization that they're trying to help, right? So they're like, I'm trying to correct something that I already face, but now I'm also responsible for solving it, for want of a better description. And what I'm finding when I go into organizations of really established ones, even ones that have been effective or are considered effective, the burden is still being carried outside of where the responsibility and power lies for the change. And so if we're going to think about, like, I would say anti-oppressive inclusion in this case, we've got to think about how these resource groups are being set up. Because if they're places to get people who are passionate to channel their energy, but they're passionate because of their lived experience, we're exploiting them. And we don't want to talk about that. And then I'm going to say the second thing is, I have found that people who are very effective in ERGs lose their professional identity. So over time, I'm an accountant, but I'm in the ERG. And now people see me as the diversity lead for whatever identity I'm representing, and not the deeply powerful accountant that I am. So now we've added this additional layer on not just the identity of the person in the ERG, but now their professional work is less visible and their identity is now being used to represent everyone's identity. And so that's an issue because we're replicating the thing we say we're changing. So I have a little bit about what we're doing to individuals unconsciously in these groups without considering how we're integrating into the actual life. Now, we need to hear voices of people with lived experience. With somebody having a personal experience, we still want the voice, but we need boundaries around it. So task forces, inclusion networks, I love them. You have a network where you center something that's really important, a topic, people who support that area being included more equitably engage in it, but it is a place of social interaction and network building so that we can strengthen and build more power. Whereas this current approach is giving groups who are already trying to activate something that's very important additional labor, and it is impacting their power within the organization and their influence. I think we need to rethink what's happening in terms of the individuals involved, what's happening to them, not just this idea about them, the ERG being required. We should thank everyone. And if you want to continue having these conversations, you will be able to contact us and we would love to continue having them. Have a good rest of the day, everybody. Thank you for joining us.